Tu diras que c'est l'instinct qui t'a.
In February 2012, students of various post-secondary institutions in Quebec took to the streets to protest planned tuition hikes to be delivered via Bill 78. This outpouring of students onto the streets was fairly new to a vast majority of Canadians and became an important news event displayed on news media organizations nightly. As the student movement playfully titled Maple Spring passed the 100-day threshold, by this time having no meaningful dialogue with provincial officials and post-secondary representatives, more students and supporters poured onto the streets of downtown Montreal. It was at this time municipal and provincial officials had police deployed to the streets to manage the protesters. During this time, minor skirmishes broke out with the police and small groups of protesters. This interaction became highly publicized in the news media and served as a tool for news media outlets to not discuss in depth what students were demanding, which was not just ending tuition hikes.
Even before it started, this demonstration seemed different than all the others. Students came dressed for a fight, wearing goggles and masks. And a fight is exactly what happened, as hundreds of students descended on their target, the convention center.
We were not doing anything wrong. We were only showing our disapproval.
Police hit back just as hard. The riot squad, out in force, started by gassing demonstrators, then, without warning, rushing them to break up the crowds. Several students were injured.
As this narrative played out in the media, the general public was faced with narrow representations of students partaking in the Maple Spring. Dominant news media organizations portrayed students in quasi-militant representation or in terms of complaining. Alternative media allowed for a more nuanced understanding of student claims towards the tuition hike and what it represents in terms of socioeconomic processes. This particular dialogue is set on the broader cultural landscape of how youth and specific students in post-secondary are represented. Popular cultural representations of youth do not present them as intellectually developed enough to articulate political demands. Looking through the lens of alternative media, the students engaged in Maple Spring contest such pop cultural representations and prove that youth are vital in challenging the norms in the body politic and/or transforming it. Many cultural theorists acknowledge the primacy of culture's role as an educational site, where identities are being continually transformed. With this understanding of culture, we can posit that the differing representations of youth are an illustration of contestation and a reclaiming of power, and alternative media plays an important role in this contestation.
C'est vite devenu un débat de société sur quel genre de gouvernement on veut, quel genre d'avenir on veut pour les générations futures.
Je pense que là, il y a une grogne générale contre la façon dont la politique est faite, dont la façon dont la société fonctionne présentement.
Authors of the article, The Spectacle of Reform, Vulture Culture, Youth, and Television, highlight the manner in which media has become obsessed with the troubled youth narrative. The hyperfixation on troubled youth and the necessity to reform them allows for youth to remain paternalized and in need of adult intervention. Such representations do not jive well with the imagery that came out of the Maple Spring, which show youth in solidarity with one another, who are not just opposing tuition hikes, but neoliberal economic policies that further widen the gap between the rich and the poor, and further allow for corporate interests to exist within universities.
Our movement here against tuition increase is part of the same wave of reaction against austerity and neoliberalism than what we have seen in US for the Occupy Wall Street, or in Europe with the Indignados movement. I think the best international role that people can play is to be mobilized in their own community, not only in solidarity with our strike, but to make education accessible elsewhere also, and especially to the students in the rest of Canada. I would invite them to be inspired by our fight, by the way we have mobilized, and to do the same thing to make sure that education is accessible, not only in Quebec, but
Here we see Gabrielle Dubois, then leader of class, express how neoliberal economic policies have affected post-secondary education. These discussions were limited and almost non-existent in mainstream news media. These clips further demonstrate the importance of alternative media. Further, alternative media allows for students that took part in this social movement to authentically tell their own stories and therefore holistically represent themselves in our culture. In the spirit of Alan Luke's offering of narratives of liberation, we see students that get to speak in alternative media reclaim their voices and reclaim a place within the body politic to resist neoliberal economic policies. In the article Stenciling Dissent, Reed explains, I stress in my history classes how dissent, strikes, and protests have given the poor, minorities, and immigrants a voice when the vote hasn't. Reed highlights the importance of dissent and protest in this article, and the Maple Spring can be read as an important demonstration of both acts, dissent against the normative neoliberal policies of privatization and corporatization, and protest, the act by which citizens exercise their authentic and liberated voices on their own streets. Dissent and protests are integral to contesting the dominant political economic order, as well as, demonstrated by the Maple Spring, it serves as an important process in contesting popular cultural representations of youth. To illustrate that youth need not be paternalized as they are active citizens engaged in their socio-economic order and cannot be rendered static.